3 days after Oman's foreign minister announced the most promising diplomatic breakthrough between Washington and Tehran in a decade, the channel that made it possible went permanently dark, and the people who built it are not talking about what comes next. This is a hypothetical scenario built from real diplomatic architecture and the structural pressures shaping US-Iran negotiations since 2015. Every institution named here is real. The specific events of February 28th, 2026 are speculative. Yet the forces that could produce them are not. On the morning of February 28th, 2026, an Iranian economist sits in a North Tehran apartment watching missile launch footage on state television. 12 hours earlier, he had been finalising a 10-year economic model with one central output: a phased sanctions relief framework. If implemented, would unlock between $1 and $2 trillion for the Iranian economy through restored oil exports, swift reintegration, and incoming foreign investment. He had spent 14 months on that number. He watches the launch footage and understands, before any official statement arrives, that the number no longer exists. What we are examining is not whether those missiles were fired. We are examining what the architecture they destroyed contained, why this targeting scenario ends a diplomatic channel when dozens of previous provocations have not, and whether any path back exists once the political conditions for mediation have been physically eliminated. In our reading of how these frameworks function, those are the three questions mainstream coverage fails to answer. Oman has functioned as a back channel between Washington and Tehran since at least 2012, and its value has never been ideological. The Omani Foreign Ministry carries institutional knowledge of what each side will and will not say without cameras present. By early 2026, in this scenario, that knowledge had produced a phased agreement in which Iran committed to reducing enriched uranium stockpiles in verified stages, with each stage unlocking a corresponding sanctions relief trench and IAEA inspectors present at every compliance checkpoint. Both sides had privately initialed the first two phases. Disputes over permanent commitments on Fordow and Natanz remained serious, but both sides were still in the room after 3 Geneva rounds, meaning the gap was being actively negotiated rather than a reason to stop talking. The $2 trillion figure was not Iranian government projection. It was independent modelling updated for current oil price floors, swift exclusion costs, and phased relief sequencing. That is what was on the table when the launch footage started playing in North Tehran. Here is what the mainstream framing of scenarios like this consistently gets wrong, and what the timeline shows when you examine structural logic rather than just the event sequence. Previous Iranian military actions, drone strikes on Saudi infrastructure, tanker seizures in the Strait of Hormuz, proxy attacks on US bases in Iraq, did not collapse the Oman Channel even when those actions occurred, while back-channel conversations were active. None of those actions directly struck the political credibility of the states, silently enabling the mediation. Gulf Cooperation Council members, including Bahrain, had quietly co-endorsed the Oman framework by allowing their territory and relationships to support it. When 12 ballistic missiles strike the US Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, the ruling family of a state that staked its private credibility on the framework has been targeted by the country the framework was designed to bring in. Oman cannot continue mediating a process whose silent guarantors have just been struck by one of the parties. So the suspension statement is not a diplomatic protest. It is a structural acknowledgement that the political architecture the mediation required no longer exists, and that distinction is what the coverage misses every time. The Iranian negotiating team in this scenario lands back in Tehran from Geneva on February 27th with what feels, for the first time in years, like genuine momentum. They go to sleep in a world where the $2 trillion figure is attached to a live process. Off they wake up on February 28th to launch footage and a suspension statement before noon. The domestic political cost of proposing a return to negotiations is now prohibitive in both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. And that double impossibility is what makes this a structural inflection point rather than a temporary setback. Serious analysts argue a new channel through Switzerland or Qatar remains viable and that the economic incentive on the Iranian side has not disappeared. Those arguments deserve consideration. But what ended this channel was not a policy disagreement. It was a physical action that destroyed the domestic political viability of engagement for any leader who would need to authorize a replacement. A new intermediary can replace Oman's geography. No intermediary can replace the political space. Both sides need to enter a negotiation. And this scenario closes that space in both capitals with the same 12 missiles. The students marching on Iranian campuses throughout early 2026 were not marching for American diplomacy. They were building their own pressure on a regime that has used external threat to justify internal control for 2 decades. The collapse of this framework removes the economic argument that made reform politically viable for factions aligned with the negotiating team and hands the security establishment exactly the siege narrative it needs. That is the cost the headline number cannot capture. If you want to follow what happens next, whether any replacement channel is structurally viable, what this collapse means for Iranians already fighting for change, and whether February 28th marks the end of this diplomatic era permanently, the next video covers exactly that.